Okay. Hello, everyone. For tonight's episode, I feel I am instructed by my inner life to comment on this concept of post-freedom realizations. And when perfectionism meets the concept of time travel. What I have considered to be of value to the human species is in some sense novelty. And what that means is that if the species is using the past to value itself, it requires to realize that its value can arise from the possibilities of the future. Just like anybody, or how would I say it, when somebody looks at the concept of guilt, it's as if there's a sort of attachment to the past. And when one looks at the concept of faith, they're attached to the future. For someone to speak about post-freedom realizations, it's as if a person telling all the communities of the world that are seeking some sort of state automata it's honestly as if after one attains enlightenment, they will not be looking for enlightenment anymore. You know, the concept of nirvana, moksha, enlightenment, it is for those beings who feel they do not have it. Something profound I learned from the Lotus Sutra was the depiction of Buddha's death. And in some sense, they suggest that at the end of his life, the Buddha was getting ready to Mahasamadhi, and his disciples were around the Blessed One. In some sense, the Buddha was known as the Blessed One. And so it's as if before the Blessed One left the world, the Buddha went into a hysteria. You know, and all the disciples were like, oh my God, if our enlightened master is freaking out, we're all doomed. You know, and so the disciples look at Buddha and they're like, why now, Buddha? Why has a hysteria befallen you? Do you know? And Buddha tells all his disciples in that moment in the story of the Lotus Sutra, where Buddha says, I have made a mistake. And his disciples are like, buddy, I prayed, I begged with a wooden bowl for you. Come on, man, you can't be wrong, you know? And so the Buddha says, very honorably, in a bodhisattvic manner, he says, I have made a mistake. We have all been enlightened from the beginning. It's another way of saying somebody who searched his whole life for freedom realized he was free from the beginning. To me, the human species will go through something similar. But for us, it's not like the freedom of the Buddha. For human beings, what's going to happen is that we will, like human beings, I'll give it, let's say, a couple hundred years. For the next 100 years, we'll still think that we're characters in a story, like physical characters in a physical world. But then there will come like a Buddhic, like a Buddha realization from the Lotus Sutra, where suddenly the human species realizes we have not been just singular and dualistic, we have been multidimensional from the beginning of life. That means it's not that the self is multidimensional, it is that the world is. And so upon this realization of multiple dimensions, this is where the talk can get interesting. I've actually made some notes for this episode. So, post-freedom realizations, I've written a sentence here which kind of explains my attitude to it. Pretty much, I've written here, imagine a post-freedom world where perfectionism is being attempted through time travel. Imagine somehow the species surpasses its suffering. Imagine tomorrow the species woke up and there was no ignorance, there was no violence, and all beings were functioning through a state of, through their original state, as a clarity, as a dimension of clarity in the world. And so it's as if, what will clarity do? Imagine 8 billion able, capable beings. Imagine all the fears that define us fade away and we get to see the ultimate self. It's another way of saying, what does the ultimate do when it has found itself? When I think about the human being, there was a time where I didn't want to touch the concept of time travel too much. But recently, it has clicked in for me that it's an underlying explanation of all the supernatural events that have happened. What I'm trying to say is that it's not just the past and present that create the reality of the human being. Really, I see reality as a series of games. And let me explain what I mean by this. The first game is to figure out what you are. So our species is still trying to, attain a sort of victory in that game. It's trying to complete that level where we're still trying to figure out what we are. Now, when we figure out what we are, that is freedom. When intelligence truly knows how it is being intelligent, that's a type of freedom. It's as if I'm trying to paint this picture. Where I'm trying to fathom the perfectionist outcome of the species. Imagine freedom was ultimate ability. So let's say when the species attained freedom, post-freedom realizations would be, in some sense, imagine 8 billion human beings that have attained their most advanced individual state. Upon individual freedom being accessed, the human being will be drawn towards collective freedom. Now, I think about, I talk about an advanced civilization in these episodes. To my knowledge, I seem to be the early bird in 2022 speaking about it in the way I am. I have fathomed that an advanced civilization is made of advanced members of that civilization. The most advanced civilization will have the most advanced members. The most advanced members can only arise upon reaching the most advanced freedom. And really, for the type of organism we are, there is two types of freedom. There's freedom of expression and freedom of perception. Now, in considering an advanced civilization, this is a post-freedom mindset. It's as if the person is not trying to be free anymore. The person is realizing they are free, and now what will freedom do in the face of an infinite void? Now, to me, this concept of a time-traveling perfectionist plays into this. Why? Because if we follow along this idea that the post-freedom state of the human being is the most advanced state, the most advanced state would be human beings going beyond their limits, and one of our greatest limitations is time. So to me, it's as if imagine there was a time traveler that lived so well in their present universe that there was no reason to actually go to the past or the future to alter anything. So imagine this time traveler. Imagine in the future they have time traveling technology, but they're living so greatly they don't need to use it. Now imagine in the year, I don't know, let's say 2700, there's a perfectionist. And this perfectionist, even though everybody, let's say in the year 2700 is living in, let's say, a great kind of near paradise world, it's as if the perfectionist from the future will travel back in time because it has solved in some sense the puzzles of its current era. So it's another way of saying that if we, let's say, built by the year 2024, like a really advanced civilization, even though that's not possible in the outer realms, but let's say like 3,600 years from now, we built a very advanced civilization. It would be as if we would reach a point where we have mastered our timeline. We have mastered our parallel universe. And so the perfectionists of the future will become multidimensional beings. If you look in the subtitle, I've written multidimensional superiority-complexes. Right now, in 2022, if somebody has a superiority complex, people are like, what's wrong with that guy? But in the future, they will realize the superiority complex is just natural when a species attempts greatness. Really, what I'm trying to say is that the most advanced human being will not fear its superiority, and it would be a very universal superiority. That means this is really how, like if somebody says, hey, Mr. Within, hey, guy talking, it's like, but how do you value yourself? I would say that as a biological organism, I value myself. As a subjective egoic entity, sure, I value myself when the ego arises. But if then somebody says as a national entity, I'll be like, sure, let's wear a jersey, right? And then if somebody says beyond nationalistic, I will tell you there's a global value I see. That means, sure, on some level I'm giving these podcasts to human beings, but it's the behavior of human beings that influences everything else, really. And then to keep this going, I perceive to myself a sort of galactic context. As much as I consider myself an earthling, I also consider myself, a child of the Milky Way galaxy. It's as if a person is not just born in the ideas of their environment, they are born based on the macrocosmic expanse. Right? I am trying to say that there is a macrocosmic vastness. It is intelligent. Our intelligence is actually in a sort of forgetful way that. But human beings, it's as if nature has a peculiar task for them. If somebody, let's say a group of extraterrestrials were looking at human beings from the sky, like hypothetically, they were like, yo, what are these human beings doing? They would be like, these human beings seem to have come into existence in order to translate or transfer inner realism back into outer realism. It's kind of like the world gives us sight, and free will changes the sight and gives it back. Pretty much I'm trying to tell you this idea that it's very similar. It's like this. It's like, in modern ways, Jordan Peterson is telling these future generations to clean their room. Back in the day, once a king was content with their kingdom, they would expand their kingdom. Okay? The idea is that when one reaches the top of the hierarchy of value in civilization, they become a guardian. It's another way of saying those with ability, they use the ability. I have thought about it. I have thought about what would a human being that has mastered all dimensions of perception be like. And the hilarious answer to that question really is that you become a servant of the realm. That means it's like, I'll share this incredible story with you. There's this wise man. He meditates in the forest, and he attains such inner peace that one day he opens his eyes and he sees like hundreds of disciples have arose. Eventually the disciples become 200 people, and then this guy begins kind of like telling them what he's doing. Right? Among these disciples of this wise sage, there was a strange disciple that from the beginning, since he had joined, he was always smiling. People had no idea why this disciple of this wise sage, why this specific disciple was always smiling. Bad scenario, good scenario, heartbreak, heart fix. It's pretty much like this disciple was always smiling. Eventually, these guys are in the forest so long, and winter comes, and the wise sage realizes they need some sort of shelter from the storm of that season. And so what happens is the wise sage goes to the nearby kingdom and pretty much knocks on the door of a king, and this king was in the kingdom at the time, and the king comes and visits the wise sage with hundreds of disciples, like monk, like, Zen, peaceful, saint-like disciples. I should say just like honest disciples. And so what happens is that the king comes and says, sure man, you're a knight and guy, bring your crew and just chill in my kingdom. But then the king says, I would like to speak with you before you leave, before the winter. And so, a little backstory about the king. This was a king where he had problems in the court. He had problems between all his wives trying to forward their princes. He had so many like inner obstacles and challenges to deal with, right? So pretty much winter is about to pass. The monks are about to leave, and suddenly, like a week or something before they leave, the king comes to this wise sage and says, "Wise sage, I've been too busy and I couldn't come and talk with you, but you're an old man, and so because you're an old man, why not stay in my kingdom and become my counselor? Become my guide, like advisor." And then the king tells the wise sage, "Send one of your disciples and let these guys go in nature and kind of like continue your legacy." So the king gives this alternative to the wise sage. The wise sage realizes he's pretty old and like, maybe this is a sign that this is how he needs to move in the world, right? And so pretty much he looks at the smiling disciple, which he was fond of, and he says, "You have become, like the leader of these guys. Go to nature and sit down and increase your inner peace. That is the purpose of why they were all there." And so the smiling sage, the smiling disciple, bows to his wise master and goes. Right, and the wise master goes and in some sense guides the lost conscience of a king. Escorts the lost conscience of a king. And so what happens is years go by, and one day, the smiling disciple comes back and tells the wise sage is living in the castle with the king. So imagine there's this room beside the king's room, and the wise sage is like sitting there as a counselor, as an advisor. And so the smiling disciple has come to, after many years, has come to visit his old master, right? And so they've sat down like these, renunciate monks, and there's like tea and stuff, and so suddenly, and everything the old wise sage is saying to the, smiling disciple, the smiling disciple just looks at, his old, teacher, his wise, this wise sage, this wise master, and he says, "Oh, what happiness! Oh, what happiness! Oh, what happiness!" Suddenly, the king walks into the room, and the king walks into the room, and so the wise sage, the moment he notices the king, he tries to stand up, and the king says, no, please sit down, But then the king sees that the smiling disciple doesn't show honor and respect to the king. And so the disciple is just continuing his conversation with his wise master, and he says, "Oh, what happiness, oh, what happiness." Super cheerful. And then suddenly the king, his ego kicks in, and he gets angry. Sorry, guys. I have allergies, and these coughs are a bit, unnecessary to be on recording, but I apologize again. Right now, I'm trying to one day build towards a legit studio, kind of like, right now, the way I'm recording these talks is pretty much very, like medieval technology, hopefully in the future I'll have like this, Jarvis-like computer, and then it would be like, but anyways, my attention is going elsewhere. I'll finish the story and continue. And again, sorry for the extra noises. At least people can know that it's like, a human lived on the earth. To err is to be human. So anyways, back to the story. The king walks in, the smiling disciple doesn't show respect. The king gets angry, and the king looks at the wise sage and says, "It seems that your foolish disciple, has sat so long doing nothing, being responsible for nothing, that he's just kind of gone crazy and saying, 'Oh, what happiness, like a fool.'" you know. And as the king is saying this, like midway through, suddenly the wise sage stops the king and says, "King, hold your words." And then the wise sage goes on to explain why that disciple was smiling. So imagine this angry king being like, "How dare this, monk not show respect to me, the smiling disciple not showing respect to me, I'm the king of the land," right? Suddenly, the wise sage is saying, "Yo, relax, man, there's something you don't know about this guy." And then he goes on to say that the smiling sage, once upon a time, he was a man where he was escorted by guards. He was a man that everybody in the kingdom knew. He was a man that in some sense, history books remembered his name. And then the guy suddenly realizes the reason the smiling disciple, the sage actually says it. The sage says that this guy was a king, and he reached the top of his kinghood. He reached the summit of kinghood, and suddenly he realized there is a hollowness to the dimensions of life that could be there, right? And he renounces his crown. He renounces his throne, and he goes into nature as a simple man and lives there. And the wise sage says, and now he has found true happiness. And so this king is humbled, by a king ahead of him. To me, when I look at the archetype of the king, it is another way of saying the archetype of the most advanced. Even though the kings have had flaws in human history, but to me, the concept of a king, do you know? The concept of a source authority. The moral of that story was that when you reach the top of your archetype or the spectrum of your meaning, you reach a point where you let go of how the past, you let go of the crown of the past, and you become like the common man of the present. And then from the common man of the present, you realize that there is an inner greatness that is required before the outer greatness. It's another way of saying once the body has attained its efficient state, it attained mastery, the mind requires to attain mastery. But the issue with the mind attaining mastery is another way of saying the mind masters its ability to project any world. I don't know how many people listening to this, they're a perfectionist or not. But I'll be honest, for me, there's a dimension to me that's very perfectionist-like, but it's a perfectionist-like dimension through geometry. Do you know, I'm like a kind of silly philosopher, I'm like this silly philosopher who's, simultaneously a geometrical perfectionist. To me, life has a shape, and the rhythms of life bring forth new shapes. Our species should not fear the idea of the future. We have reached that point in history where just knowing what happened in the past or assuming what happened in the past is not enough. And just being present is not enough either. What requires to happen is the initiation of a great collective event. Language is the spark. Communication is the fire that in some sense illuminates a path forward. pretty much the most advanced thing that creatures are doing is that they are moving physically as objects, and they are vocally, through acts of communication through different dimensions, they are moving as a subject. Do you see, dear listeners, do you see why I have gone towards mysticism? Because that's really all you can do when it comes to the outer realms. When it comes to the outer realms, you can move your body physically around, or you can orchestrate its movement in accordance to what you find in your inner realms, or in some sense, do you see what I'm saying? I'm saying we can move objects and subjects in front of our eyes, but behind our eyes, we can visually, like in an app through abstraction, move an object. But when it comes to communication, what is inner communication is actually a space-like intelligence watching what's happening within it. What I'm trying to say is that who you are behind your eyes is the instantaneous presence of a field of activity which, when we give it life, it becomes awareness. That means it's very strange. It's very hard to pinpoint where the soul is, because there is a chance that the body and mind are projections of greater dimensions. What I'm trying to say is that some people, I shouldn't say everybody, but I think deep down it's an evolutionary urge. But there's an urge to conquer within everyone. And I would say, just like there was this, like old Cherokee story, this wise story, where this grandchild goes to his grandfather, who was the chief of, the tribe. And let's say, the grandfather, who was the chief, was having a meeting with all the other chiefs of all the other tribes, and suddenly his young grandson runs out of nowhere in front of, that chieftain meeting, right? And the grandson's like, "Grandpa, tell me a story," and the grandpa, instead of saying, "I'm in a meeting, get out of here, kid," the grandpa just pauses and kneels to be on the same level of his grandson, the same height of his grandson, and all the other chiefs are like, "What story is this dude going to say to his grandson?" Right? And he says this story to his grandson, and he says he's saying it as if he wants the chieftains to hear it too. He says, "Inside you, there is a battle. There is a battle between two giant wolves." And the kid's like freaking out. "There's two giant wolves inside of me, Grandpa?" And the grandpa's like, "Yeah." And one of these giant wolves is black, and it's dark in the sense of the archetype of just, how can I tell you? It's like the yin-yang symbol. The dude's pretty much telling his grandkid, teaching the yin-yang symbol to his grandkid. So in some sense, it's kind of like there's a wolf that represents the yang, which represents the chaos, and there's a wolf which represents the yin, which represents the order. It's not like this Cherokee chieftain is talking about, saying the actual yin-yang symbol word, but he's pretty much explaining to his grandson that there's a battle between these two wolves, these two forces, call them good and evil, whatever you like, And so, between these two forces, this battle that is taking place, suddenly the grandson asks the grandpa, which wolf wins? And the grandpa looks at all the chieftains, then looks at his grandson, and he says, "The one you feed." Okay? That's really very important, Now, I keep thinking that the perfectionism of a singular dimension, like the world we're in right now, human beings are being controlled by time, but if they take the conqueror's attitude, that means time is a conqueror and we're also a conqueror. And so it's as if this clash of the conquerors. Imagine the day comes, human beings master time, And to me, of course, on some level, in the outer realms, time travel is impossible. Because the moment the time traveler is added to the past world, that past world is not the same past world. So in some sense, time travel cannot happen, because moments happen and vanish. But anyways, let's just fathom its possibility, and we somehow managed to master time travel, and we had this sort of perfectionist attitude in the species where we were not just considering ourselves as multidimensional beings, but we were considering ourselves at the edge of the superiority of our knowledge. That means we were behaving like the superior beings of the dimension. The brilliance of doing this is actually not that you get locked into a sort of subjective artificial godhood, but really the reason of doing this is to get to see what the greatest response in the unknown is. You see, on some level, sure, a human being in a giant world, but on another level, a conscious entity trying to contact and communicate and interact with the collective unconscious. And if you're a panpsychist, it's like, how can I tell you everything is alive? I'm going to go back to my notes here. I've written a question: how would the future protect itself? This could be a good question. I would love to see more philosophy teachers, give assignments like this to their students in academic systems. Imagine we wanted to go save the past. Imagine people in the year 2022 wanted to go to the year, let's say, go to the 1700s or 1600s and try to save the world. You see that the issue, this is, I think, something people haven't even considered, even I haven't considered up to this moment, where the time traveler doesn't know its own future. It's another way of saying maybe the only future self that could time travel is the last future self. Maybe the last, future parallel reality is like the final. What I'm trying to say is only the edge of the universe can go back through time to the other edge. I would say that the future will realize to protect itself, it may want to go change the past. To protect itself, it can trust in its ability in the present. Or to protect itself, it can go into its future. You see, it's as if before the time traveler ever needs a reason to come back in time, it has more of a reason to be in its own time and to go see the edge of that parallel universe, right? The species right now has a fear of multidimensionality. Why? Because we don't know how to manage it, right? And the reason we don't know how to manage it is because the species is lost in a linguistic simulation. What this means is that language has possessed a multidimensional being from its recognition of how it is actually being multidimensional. When I say multidimensional, guys, that's not an easy word to use. It's a word that becomes important to use when we realize the mind is unknown. Believe it or not, we're living in, I say this a lot in the talks, we're living in the pre-knowing what the mind is era. Everybody says they have a mind, but nobody knows what the mind is. Because in schools of thought, in certain schools of thought, the mind is in some sense has a subjective value, and subjects are in the domain of imagination. It's like the human being is caught in this bizarre existential and experiential situation where it's like, yeah, I see the world, I can touch the world, and I see it's real, but at the same time, the consciousness is being attributed to an inner self. What I'm trying to say is that behind our eyes, we are in a field of activity that can use time. that can create time and many variations of it. But in front of our eyes, because matter is changing at a certain pace, it's another way of saying like reality is imagination that you didn't have to imagine, and it's an imagination that's imbued with animate life force. The way the future protects itself is in some sense by going into the future. It's another way of saying the species is walking the staircase, and right now we're on the staircase where we're temporary biological beings. Then the next staircase is going to become immortal as long as possible biological beings. Then the next staircase could be just immortal, just non-biological beings. And then eventually we'll reach a point where it's as if this species, imagine at like million years our species survived, and we were like, how, like, are we gonna reproduce all over the universal sector? Like, what's the purpose of the continuity of the human being? What I'm trying to say is that the greater dimensions, at least how I have fathomed them so far, and I feel the ancients were on the same page, that they are actually revelations in how, like right now, because of a mind, we're interested in states of being, but in greater dimensions you are being, and the state is a possibility. So what that means is, in front of your eyes you're being like a singular physical self. Behind your eyes you are being that space where there is a possibility of all the ways you can look at the world before you make a decision. Behind your eyes you are the unknown witness of worlds. In front of your eyes you are the actualizer. If you ask a yogi what has been the biggest obstacle to the human species, it may say the concept of a self. You see, the bizarre thing about truth is that as a requirement of the definition of truth, it needs to instantaneously be. That means there's some people trying to act truthfully. I don't know how that's possible, but there is being truthful. The future's protection is only faith. You see, it's pretty much a shift from known variables of possible reality to unknown variables. If a person goes beyond 50% unknown, right, this is where the psychology has to like, my personal experiences are very mystical in nature. Why? Because they went to a point of dehumanization. I would say I have experienced states where right now, like, of course there's a biological body, there's a personality behind my words, but I have experienced states of being that are like living geometry. I don't know how to tell you this. It's just design. It's just everything is geometry. It's like they say, like the cosmos is made of atoms. It's as if everything is shape. Knowledge is staring at shape, and based on its movement, the unknown becomes known to it. The superior state of mankind is to reach the peak of knowledge, and when you reach the peak of knowledge, you find that there's an unknown sky. This unknown sky means that you have to actually open the wings of your mind, and then a flight will occur. Let's say ancients call it enlightenment. The way I term it is that there will come a moment where the personality will notice it is being watched, and it is not being watched by the invisible other. It is being actually watched by the invisible world. It's another way of saying that moment a person wakes up from a dream, but the conscious waking state is so strange because it's like a dream where you can try to wake up from, but you cannot. Do you know? And so the ancient yogis had this kind of intense mentality, but then they came to this realization that the scene of the scene is unseen. excuse me, the seer of the seen is unseen. It's another way of saying that meditation oh man. Excuse me, guys. Pretty much I'm trying to say there's an unknown presence to our intelligence, okay? If the potential of this unknown presence to our intelligence, if it activates, it will reach its ultimate archetype. When it reaches its ultimate archetype, it will have nothing to do, because there seems to be this strange thing where it's like ultimate individual ability is synonymous to the collective paradise. That means it's as if, like, on some level, people need to reach their most advanced state, and then upon reaching the most advanced state, they'll notice that their knowledge is layers of construction. And the intuition and the Jungian synchronicities are trying to lead the person to a state where the mystery of the realm is greater than their beliefs, so they have no choice but to have faith in a present moment of direct experiential revelation over any sort of ideological layout. Excuse me, guys, I'm coughing too much this episode. Let me see what I can say to finish this off. Post-freedom realizations means that the desire for the ultimate, the desire for advancement has been reached. The time-traveling perfectionist can have this approach that doing nothing is perfection, and then trying to change everything is perfection. Really what it is, it's how far we see and how far we can reach what we see. Imagine a time traveler comes back to change the past. like comes back to his past self, and then his past self gets angry. It's like, what are you doing, man? Go back to the future, you know. You know, one can even say there can be an infinite time traveler regression or expression. What that means is, imagine, you know, when one future self comes back to the past to fix the past and change the past, all the parallel universes need to now, all the future selves need to come to the past. The human mind has imagined angels. It has imagined aliens. It has imagined fictional creatures. Now, to imagine a future self is really too bizarre. I think that time is actually a portal. The other side of time is non-conceptual living. That means, is there more to life than just scolding, you know, a time-traveling future self? To me, anything that was an unnatural force in nature, to me, is like the future self. You know, to me, angels, aliens, you know, they're all the future self. You imagine an alien comes to invade like human beings, and then the alien comes down, and before it invades human beings, it declares it to, let's say, this philosopher walking in the park. And this philosopher looks at this alien that wants to invade Earth. Or imagine the alien asks the human being, the philosopher walking in the park, the alien says, "Who is your master?" And the philosopher's like, okay, this alien's going old school, you know, and the philosopher looks at the alien and says, our masters are our future. And so eventually the philosopher goes on to explain to the alien that regardless of what decision both of them make, eventually the future will arrive. Everything is a sort of performance. You know, on some level, you know, there is no reason to live before it ends, right? It's as if the flame of the candle shines brightly, but when the flame of the candle is about to go, it's as if like the service of the lifetime has been done, you know? Some people think enlightenment is just like a conceptual revelation. I will tell you, there's this story from Sri Ramana Maharshi, this very liberated, enlightened sage. And so Sri Ramana Maharshi had a bunch of disciples, and all the disciples he had told to just sit in silence and stillness and kind of like be their meditation. And then to one disciple, he would give all the work of the ashram. And everybody was like, yo, why is this one disciple just doing all the labor of the ashram and nobody else is doing anything? You know, everybody's just sitting and meditating. And then they go ask Sri Ramana Maharshi, and Sri Ramana Maharshi says, that disciple is ahead of all of you, right? And Sri Ramana Maharshi goes on to say that disciple that was doing all the physical labor was paying back his karmic debt. Or I think maybe he used the term karmic credit, right? It's another way of saying that human being had finished his work of his mind. His mind's work had been done. Now his body's work remained. So it was as if that being had already become internally free, that disciple that was doing all the labor, and now only the physical karma had to complete and transition. There will come an advanced humanity. It is the birthright of the species. You know, I don't know how far my voice will go. I personally, a part of me feels like, you know, based on the potential of what can happen in this, it's like my talks are a way of bridging and the natural dimensions into cyberspace. It's as if the advanced civilization is built by advanced beings, and the most advanced beings are those who have attained inner freedom and now are trying to build it in the outer realms. You know, on some humorous level, I see these Mr. Within talks targeted to all the mystics, you know, and all the conscious beings in the universal sector. You know, for the first time, it's not for the first time, but I would say for the first time in this lifetime, I will tell you guys, I have not found a more beautiful idea than the idea of the advanced civilization. Somebody would be like, Mr. Within, what about heaven? I would tell you the advanced civilization is heaven on earth. It would be efficiency being given permission to manifestation. It's as if, imagine, you know, the world was about to destroy itself, and this young child, you know, let's say this young Indian child suddenly shouted to the sky and said, Brahman, Vishnu, Shiva, hear me now, you know? And suddenly the gods of the dimension, the three, you can say, minds of the universal sector appear in front of this kid. You know, and Brahman is known as the spirit of creation. It's like how the world, it's like this, it's like how the world soul creates as a deity. Okay, so Brahman is the spirit of creation. Vishnu is the spirit of maintenance. Shiva is the destruction. And so now imagine this child at the end of, like, when human beings are about to destroy themselves, this young child shouts and calls upon these, you know, ancient avatars of truth. And these ancient avatars arise, and the child says, do you know, show me the greatest creation, the greatest maintenance, and the greatest destruction. And in that moment, Shiva walked up to the child and said, if you want to see the greatest creation, the greatest destruction must be absent. And then suddenly, let's say Brahman suddenly came to the child and said, if you want to see the greatest maintenance, the greatest creation must be absent. What I'm trying to tell you is that when a human being contacts and experiences and meets the unknown, they become fearless in the eyes of both outer and inner manifestation. They become unconditional. It's as if when you realize you are the unknown, knowledge cannot touch you. It cannot be you. You know, it's like we are being knowledge more than knowledge is being us. It's another way of saying that we are, based on the range of our brain's awareness, receiving the realm. else is there to say? I think I've covered everything. And when I say I've covered everything, I mean everything in existence, guys. What else can I talk about? Non-existence and the inconceivable is really the final thing, the final word. Who knew the evolution, the greatest evolution of language would occur through the silence? Who knew that through effortless, simple states of being, the spirit of nature activates? What the body is, what the body is a way of the universe meeting itself. Many people don't know this, but a reason why religions have extended is because, I know this is a tangent, but I'm going to say it. Religions have expanded because religion provided an infinite desire. It's another way of saying that when somebody fights for a truth, there is a might behind it that is not there if you're just fighting for fun, right? So we can see human beings on the planet, like these brains kind of sprouting into psychologies, and then these psychologies looking for truth, not realizing that it's a changing world. Really, the only truth is change. But the greater truth of change is that change cannot be considered or fathomed unless there is a changeless dimension. To a scientist, if you say that we're temporary beings, the scientist would say, of course we are. You know, if you ask the philosopher, are we temporary beings, the philosopher would say, how do you know? How would you have the concept of the temporary without the simultaneous validity of the concept of the eternal? It's as if you have to believe in the eternal before you can have the concept of the temporary. It's like, for me, theists and atheists are the same, you know? The theist believes in God, and the atheist has to believe in God to then disbelieve it. When I think about the future, if it's dehumanized, it has no reason to come back to the past. If it's humanized, it may have a reason to come back to the past. If it reaches the edge of the future, imagine the edge of the future was like a subway station that reached the final station, right? You know, this light train reached the edge, you know, of the edge of the cosmos, and so then the light, in some sense, has no other option but then to come back. You know, my relationship with the notion of the future, I'll be honest, it arises from this perception that I feel right now I am being my future self's memory. And so it's another way of saying that it's like, if today I can remember who I was yesterday, right now I will be, you know, tomorrow's yesterday memory. The present becomes tomorrow's yesterday. And so when one considers there the memory of their future self, you can say intuition, or imagination is how the future self remembers you. So if how the future self contacts is that in some sense a sort of an unknown attention looks at its own memories. The human species is in such a unique position that for the first time it is considering that if we fathom an unobservable universe, we have to also fathom an unobservable self. There's a huge possibility that the world has many edges. It's as if the human being tries so hard just to see how simple it is. And once we have attained truth simply, complexity remains. The human being fears the future because it doesn't know itself belongs there. It's as if, imagine a person's ancestry, like the spirits of their great ancestors could come and visit them, and they ask the let's say current generation, and they were like, okay, what do you like about your world, and so the answer would be, and this is really where greatness begins, is that what the future holds is the destiny of all that has happened. The concept of the future is the keeper of destiny. It's as if there's a plan, but this plan is very multidimensional. 8 billion creatures on a rock and hovering in the middle of the void. They are so convinced by their microcosmic lives that they never wonder about their macrocosmic birthright. It's like, this is something I haven't seen a lot of enlightened gurus say, where they look at the disciple and they're like, where do you think you're seeing me from? What is within you is how the secret of the cosmos is breathed. Post-freedom realization means universal responsibility. We are wondering about what kind of a great being, or how great would a being need to be to become responsible for its universal sector, to become stewards of the realm. This is really, to me, the concept of the pilots of consciousness and the advanced communicators. That what's going to happen is that there's going to be such spectacular children born in the future, such brilliant children, that it's going to be as if we're going to see the greatness of mankind land on Earth, but from behind our eyes. Imagine somebody said that your future self is everyone. That in the future, the comprehension of the mind will not be devoid of collectivism. In the future, your mind will be everything. Right now, our minds have just awoken in the body of an animal, and it's another way of saying that any human being alive in 2022, we are experiencing one of the most blessed stages on this earth. People don't realize the advantage we have. it's as if with a few chess moves and advance humanity, you know, its dance begins. There is greatness behind everybody's eyes. It just needs to be released. And how you release it is that you find something so important in this life that no longer self-suffering applies. You know, it's as if the person went through all hardship and he managed to get through it, and then they were like, how do you do it? And the person responded, I never disbelieved victory. You know, there's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson that I've recently learned, and it's one of the most remarkable quotes. It was like, it revolutionized my approach to a lot of things. Ralph Waldo Emerson says, win as if you're used to it, and lose as if it's refreshing to experience it for a change. Something in those lines. He's trying to say that the species no longer needs to fear its collective superiority. You know, individual superiority, sure. Like, let's say in the future there's going to be robots, and these robots are going to survey, you know, so they're going to view people's psychologies, and anytime somebody like behaves like a dictator, they're like, yo, dictator, you know, the robot alarms go, you know, it's like dictator located, you know, potential dictator located, right? What I'm trying to tell you is that really we should learn from Alexander the Great, because when he passed away, he commanded that his arms be open rather than crossed, and people were like, why were Alexander's arms open on the boat? And the story is, like, the meaning of it is that he wanted to tell the world, I came and conquered everything, I became an emperor, but even an emperor leaves this world empty-handed. So the games of matter are ones that inevitably end, and sure, a person can seek pleasure, joy, you know, and try to live a fun life, but you will realize at some point the deeper sense of honor requiring to be activated through service. You know, I am saying that serving the past could be foolish. Serving the present could be challenging, but serving the future is perfect. And I wish to see in this lifetime a day where, you know, let's call it one day, you know, we call it the day of advanced civilization. One day every year where human beings gather around and they just fathom as far as they can the greatness of the civilizations that will come. You know, it's like future civilization appreciation day, you know. Or advanced civilization appreciation day. That would be like a, you know, great honor bestowed. The future is another way of saying how will you use the dimensions of your perception to enter what you see in the future. The Japanese have this saying, they say the man is the room he's in. And so if we take this approach that the brain is simulating waves, these waves in response to the sensory reception become manifest as worlds. It's another way of saying imagination is made up of reality, but it's reality moving in ways that are unreal. It's as if imagination is reality moving in a strange way. But at its core, it requires reality as a sort of, you know, position, foundation, yeah. You know, as someone who talks a lot about Vedanta, I have thought about the concept of karma. And I have made what you would say a philosophical risk. You you know. And what I mean by this is that I concluded the result of metaphysics. I concluded the conclusion of metaphysics being a round circle. So to me, divinity was something that is inconceivable, but then once you are the inconceivable, only the conceivable remains. That means it's as if in higher dimensions, poetically, the gods don't need to have karma, and in the lesser dimensions, the karmic climate is so heavy that they cannot even fathom the question, right? You know, the human position is very important. The human position is literally like as if you found yourself in the driver's seat of a corner of the universe. Imagine 8 billion minds trying to solve one problem. That to me is like a wonder of the world. You know, the concept of the advanced civilization is one of the most grounding ideas. You know, it's as if we've reached a point where we're like, okay, the civilization is like a painting being drawn on an empty piece of paper. Now that we've realized the paper is empty, any probability of it is possible. You know, one day I hope to, you know, I think I have a sort of, like when it comes to geometric drawings, I think I have a sort of, you know, odd talent. And I hope one day I can teach people how to draw like the way I draw, because it is an attitude. You know, it's an artistic approach that it comes with a sort of pre-consideration of meaning, right? It's like a person. It's honestly how energy is being released and how consciously it's being done. Now somebody could say, Mr. Within, what is the highest conscious state? And I will tell you, the highest conscious state is faith as the world. That means the greatest psychological state is collective beingness. You know, or another way of saying collective existentialism. Or collective experientialism. I don't know how to word it. I'm just trying to tell you that when everything is comfortably being everything, that is the finish line of the karmic entity. The inseparability of the individual dimensions of life with how they have to exist in order for the collective to be there. You know? You know, it's as if the human being, a philosopher thought, theological philosopher was like, wait a minute, if human beings didn't exist, what would God be watching? You know? Like if human beings disappeared, right? To me, human beings are just the most advanced thing that's happening in this universal sector. And to go beyond time is a strange perfection. That means it's like you can only be a perfectionist if you've transcended time. Do you know? And it's so phenomenal because the human being, it's not just like I don't talk about it that much because I don't know if I'm the best person. You know, it's like I feel comfortable sharing my inner visions, but when it comes to talking about emotions, I don't know if I am, you know, capable or worthy enough to talk about too much about emotional things, right? Like there is passion involved in an advanced civilization, but sometimes a person can be dehumanized to themselves, and when they're dehumanized to themselves, they don't have desires that are humanized. They have collective desires. So it's another way of saying, like, imagine you manage to your mind connected to the spirit of the future, and so to the momentum of how the future was entering the present, right? I'm trying to say, imagine your mind found a rhythm right? And this rhythm had a sort of infinitude to it that made you experience timelessly your body, right? Like people can experience this. If you're a persona, a sort of ego, you experience your body in time, but there is an ability where when the mind stops, like, creating ripples on the pond. Excuse me. Had to savor that ice cappuccino. Man, I'm just trying to say that towards the inconceivable we go. And upon the completion of the individual life, individual desires, you just become content with them. It's another way of saying, like, it's like the paradox of honoring nature and at the same time being trapped in a simulation. It's as if you honor the truth of the moment, but you feel also an artificial dimension to it. But really, if the truth of the moment is there, the artificial is the shadow. In the Yoga Patanjali Sutras, one of the most incredible statements, like they share, like it's shared in that book, and it says that this world we're in is the shadow of the real world. I'm trying to say that it may be a bit too soon, but I think eventually it will be said that what the inner witness, the unknown inner experiencer or witness is that it is the same moment within everybody. That means existence is another way of saying the common denominator of all phenomena. Existence is like the universe is one singular event. Time is when the universe is two or more events. Or I shouldn't say two or more. Time is when the universe is two events. The timeless is when you are going two or more, or two plus infinity. That means when infinite archetypes awaken within the individual, they no longer see chaos and order. They begin wondering about infinite chaos and infinite order, right? And they're both magnificent. Infinite chaos, if you get rid of the religious connotation and that whole Dante's Inferno imagery to it, you can see chaos as being the power of randomity. And then you can see order as to be the intention of the upper world. So to me, I will tell you, in any moment I live, there is not really good or bad people. There is just forces at work. And it's as if intelligence, it's like fields overlapping. Do you know? And so it depends on what animates in the moment. That means I'm trying to say, like, from the moment you wake up, whoever you are, if you just, till the end of the day, when you go back to bed and sleep, you just scan every moment, as if every moment you're watching to see what the world reveals to you. Do you know? You will notice a rhythm in your inner realms, and then you'll notice your intuition being a sort of allowance to bring instantaneously meaning into phenomena. I don't know how to tell you, but there's so many advanced ways that we can use our intelligence, and the whole species needs to go into this giant research project of what is the best case scenario. You know, they should create this TV show game being called How Do We End Extinction? You know, and you know, the winner of it gets $1 million if they have an answer. You know, those would be the greatest TV shows. There's so many ways to liberate oneself. The future is just how I am trying to find what is in common with secular society and non-secular societies. You see, it's as if we have to all agree on one thing or on common principles in order to build the advanced civilization. So it's like a philosopher wondering, okay, what do 8 billion, minds moving as, bodies in one world, like what could they, how do I say it? It's like, what is their potential? We think technology is unnatural, but guys, language was an unnatural technology. It made no sense, right? To me, it's as if there has been an objective evolution and there has been a subjective evolution, and the subjective evolution has been ignored. It's very hard to ideologically touch the inconceivable, guys. Sometimes when I give these talks, I'm like, it's like, how do I hold nothing through the truth of everything? On some angle, we want a freedom beyond duality. On another angle, we need duality to update civilization. It's as if, like, the advanced civilization, its members will have, in some sense, found peace and contentment with the void. They have found peace and contentment with singular moments of truth, with singularities of reality. They have found contentment with dualities of the world, with all the good and bad worlds that could exist. And then they have found contentment with the infinite, which means like you become pretty much speed, and then after you have become like this fast movement, eventually there is no conception anymore. Right? It's as if the clue of how, if life was a simulation, it's the clue of how we surpass the simulation is actually the light in our eyes. It's as if the person's like, oh my god, I'm a soul. Then they're like, okay, why is my soul here? And then they wonder about where is here when the mind is the mind is projecting the outer realms. Sometimes it's very hard to say if we see others or we're just our brain happening. And human intelligence is just too fascinating, really. I have a prediction that in the future, violence is going to stop. And then, people are going to be like, oh my god, how did violence stop on Earth? And then they realize the species acknowledged that the mind was a superior access to life. And this superior access to life means that it's as if what is being prioritized over violent survival is the intellectual capability of the species to build a world where as many blind spots as possible are being covered. The era of advanced communication has begun. Right now, the most important thing the world needs is, in some sense, the poetry of new eyes. The world needs to learn to look at itself again and again and again until it liberates. Post-freedom realization is another way of saying that there's no longer a concept of freedom for the free being. That means those beings who are truly free, they're not looking for freedom. Or it's another way of saying those beings who are truly advanced, they are advanced. That means it's as if in the outer realms, I need to talk about an advanced civilization, but behind my eyes, space is the finale of all matter, changing matter. Sometimes I think that, okay, let's say a time traveler, may hear this talk of mine, or let's say this talk of mine echoes into history, guided by, winds of eternity. And so I would say to the future generations, to all the humanized and dehumanized future generations of consciousness, of human consciousness, of biological consciousness, I will say this, that the past was always burdened by its own past. All generations of human beings have wondered, like, what did people do before I was born? Right? Like, every person wonders about that. It's just part of understanding. And so, because the past had an expectation for the future and the present has access to this, the present feels it has to carry the torch of the past. But really, the most important thing is that the foundation of civilization be built on the natural biological human entity. It's like, how do you keep biology alive? How do you keep nature alive for a future that could potentially become robots? Imagine people wanted to expand their lifespans, and robotically you could do that somehow. And so the person was like a cyborg, but they were living like 2,000 years or something. We require to keep nature alive by associating a sacredness of it not being disturbed. It's as if, like, imagine you're a guest and you've gone to the house of the host, right? Imagine God has this house party, right? And imagine you're invited to this house party, okay? And so the host hasn't come, right? And the guests are just in the house party being like, where's the host? Somebody says, I know the host. Somebody says, my dad's the host, But what I'm trying to tell you is just the archetype of the host is the concept of the creator. The archetype of the guest is the creation. In ancient metaphysical thought, their consideration was that we are the mind of God. We are in the mind of God. Like the ancient Vedic thought believed, like, we're the dream of God, like God's sleeping right now. People are like, why isn't Brahman answering my prayers? And people are like, Brahman's sleeping, but 3 days of Brahman sleeping is like 64. I don't know what the number is, like millions of years for human life. What I'm trying to say is that consciousness chooses how far it continues. Upon all intellectual victories, eventually there will come the profoundness of the silly being. Like, I don't know how to tell you, but like, to me, I feel the concept of comedy exists to counter the intellectual conflicts. Like, just like how people need like UN negotiators, like UN translators in the UN for world leaders to talk. Imagine there's also like instead of a UN translator, there's also a UN comedian. And this comedian, whenever like the world leaders are arguing, like, just, cracks a joke. It's like, hey guys, don't take it seriously, we're all dying here anyways, And imagine the UN laughs to like rejoice in like a peaceful outcome. Anyways, this episode is guys, this is one of those episodes that makes you feel like you're inside a giant robot in space that needs to hold swords, It's as if the person's like, I honored my ancestors, and then, they're like, wait a minute, I honored everybody in the present, including the world. Then they're like, wait a minute, I need to honor my future. That means really the concept of an advanced civilization, I honestly feel it will be interesting for people if they honor their future. If they don't honor the future of the species, it's as if our emotions possessed us from our collective greatness. Sometimes I think, imagine like this hypothetical sci-fi scenario, and this extraterrestrial lands on Earth, and this extraterrestrial, let's say it's an enlightened Andromedan, like extraterrestrial being, hypothetically, okay? And so let's say this enlightened Andromedan being comes to the planet, and then people on the planet are like, we're at civil war, like the species is fighting among itself, right? And then they ask this, what do you call it? Imagine all the leaders of the world ask this enlightened extraterrestrial alien from Andromeda to like help them solve the world issues. And then the extraterrestrial, imagine the enlightened Andromeda looks at human leaders and he says to them, I can do it, but do you want me to do it, right? And so imagine all the leaders are like, please, we're like all killing each other, like this is the last chance, and we don't know what to do. And so imagine the extraterrestrial snaps its, like, I don't know, fingers, or does something of the sort, and in one instant, or it just sings a song, and in one instant every human being on the planet, it's as if like a reset switch has been put at the back of their mind, and every person's emotional context has been reset, right? And so everybody's like looking at the world for the first time, do you know? In some sense, what I'm trying to say is that the extraterrestrial, then enlightened Andromedan, snapped its fingers and in some sense made the species grateful by, in some sense, removing the unnecessary abstract burden of the past. Do you know? It's like it's another way of saying, are you willing to sacrifice your individual suffering, for collective peace? And the answer is that suffering can be dissolved prior to even the advanced civilization. It's another way I'm saying that, like, when in this life, whoever you're listening to me, when in this life would you get the opportunity to just for a moment consider that perfection is space? Space to me is the most perfect thing, right? But when I look at what's happening in space, I'm like, look at these imperfections, The future will realize to love the present is an ultimate strategy. Human beings in the future there will come an era of romanticism where it's right now we're just in the like before it starts phase. But there will come a moment where there will come lovers of the realm. These are people who have fallen in love with what the whole system deserves, not just what parts of it deserve. It's as if somebody became a king in a world where, imagine you become like the king of a kingdom that everybody's suffering in. It's as if, what king? Who has hell put on the crown on who? Right? Eventually there comes a point where you want to, in some sense, challenge and like a mighty force combat, the injustice of indecency. Like, to me, the strategies to advancing civilization is we have to find a way to get 8 billion inner universes to trust the outer realms, to trust the world. We need to get 8 billion beings to be able to trust the world, and not just to trust it as a belief, but to trust it in a way where they are allowing the greater freedoms behind their eyes to play a role in the context of their outer life. What I'm trying to tell you is that to build an advanced civilization on Earth, we start from the most advanced position in our inner realms, and then we live in the outer realms. The most advanced position in the inner realms is instantaneous peace. The search is over. It's instantaneous ability. It's the recognition that any moment your mind to look down on itself, it could have used the same energy to look up. And when you truly look up, you see that just like the sky, the edge of consciousness is the inconceivable. It's as if we can't see that far, and so how can we know what we are conscious? The brain to me is an instrument. It's like an instrument that needs to be played before the instrument is taken away. Attention has been born, and because it has been born, it has the privilege of exiting the realm. You know, one of the greatest sayings, if there was a museum of language, like this sentence should go in it. There's this saying, I don't know what culture it's attributed to, but the saying says when the child is born, the world laughs and the child cries. And when I say the world laughs, like the world celebrates cheerfully. So the quote says, when the child is born, the world laughs, and then the world it laughs and the child cries. Then the second part of the quote is so heavy, and it says, when the man dies, the world cries and the man laughs. That means you live away in this world where your exit, it's as if like, you know, it's as if joy is the ultimate way we can make sure the future generations don't suffer. And joy is the freedom we find in our nature. I remember I was giving this talk in Iran, I think it's episode 438, and it doesn't have subtitles, so I don't know how people are going to understand it if you don't speak the Farsi language. But I remember in part of the talk, I was telling people that it's like you can either go in nature or you can realize your mind is nature. It's as if we are a natural part of this world. Like it's not like soil is our shoes, like trees. You know, it's more like it's more like we are walking on the earth, but we are the earth simultaneously. When a human being discovers their nature, there comes a bliss, there comes a grace. That grace is enough to redeem any sort of guilt from the past. And regardless of who the person is, I mean, really, all karmic suffering starts from a self. It all starts from where the attention is. Somebody's like, hey man, you know, what's your truth? And the person's like, my truth is normally where I'm walking towards, you know. To me, the existential dimensions of life have been observed successfully. The experiential dimensions of life have been observed successfully the moment I realized the unknown is the end of knowledge. That means either we experience our being through the unknown, or we exist as the temporary known. As the winds of evolution usher the species forth, as 8 billion minds activate on the planet, as a liberated global humanity emerges. I've spoken about this in my science fiction as the enlightened society. When the enlightened societies arise, the beauty of the greatest design surpasses any game of power. It's as if the species outgrew greed. It's as if evil got bored of destruction, and order got bored of preservation, and only the novelty. It's as if like there is something that the present is building and the past is assisting, and so what it builds is like it's the glory of the future. And the intensity of your inner realms can be chosen. For me, sometimes my inner realms, I feel it's like teleportation. Just my attention can see multiple things and just zoom in on one of them and still see the other ones later. You know. To be free, partner of an advanced civilization means that some part of you deep down knows that the future is already great. We are just ones that are, it's as if like the future sent a message in a bottle, and prophets walked the earth. And so now it's like the human beings are sending a message to the future. And this is where the honor of the future comes in. You see, is it enough that the human being lived well? Is it enough that just the species lived well? Is it enough that a sort of galactic expression lived well? And eventually you will see, from the individual we journey to the universal, and upon reaching the universal, the liberation of that presence is beyond any personality's beliefs. You reach a state of mind where the unknown knows it is witnessing. And that's when ego no longer burdens you. It's as if you're done with the ego in this lifetime. It doesn't mean you don't have an ego. It just means that it's as if you have awakened beyond subjectivity. Most people are entranced by linguistic subjectivity, right? This is the biggest challenge of the poet. That means there's a type of poetry that closes worlds, that like limits them. And there's a type of poetry that shouts at this temporary, bewildered animal that's evolving, that in some sense, the infinite, it awaits. It is the future of the mind that is accelerating. I have this very bold claim that everybody on the planet will come to this conclusion that an advanced civilization is the ultimate argument. It is the argument of arguments. Either humanity waits for the world to give it purpose, or humanity becomes its purpose. The idea is not a freedom that is ignoring the responsibility of a species managing itself. Like in the future in the UN, probably there's going to be like species management, department. To honor the world in front of your eyes, to honor the worlds behind your eyes, to honor that which is looking, and to honor the realization that the unknown is the only concept that has no context. I have this feeling that if a person has listened to maybe 3 or more of these Mr.Within talks, your attention has been exposed to the rhythm of, it's as if you have heard one instrument being played, right? Similarly, every person is their own instrument, and which means that it's another way of saying your inner life can happen. You can walk in your inner life in such a way that just by how karma changes, you comprehend the nature of, how progress becomes liberation oriented. I'm trying to tell people, uncover your ability. Get to meet, or attempt, or don't have a blind desire, but just wonder about how the incredible breathe. Post-freedom means the future is already enlightened. And so the perfectionist would in some sense be one who organized time just to realize it all mattered to the viewer. Imagine somebody in the future freaks out and they're like, I'm going to use a time machine and go to the past and change things. And somebody else comes and says, hey man, don't disturb the time of the world. Instead, wonder about who is suffering or who can lose when it's unknown. Imagine there's some people who think they're spirits and that's how they know they're beyond their body and mind, and there's some people who have experienced the unknown and they understand that it has no boundary. It's as if, like, I'm trying to say, it's as if one member of a species being like, hey guys, maybe we are way more advanced than how we have consumed information so far. Become a student of your own eyes and you will become the greatest teacher. Dear listeners, genius no longer needs to be shy. The responsibility for the future is too great for efficient findings from inner realms not to be shared with the outer realms. Where is the world being driven to? So right now I'm sitting on my balcony and I'm thinking in the future, like imagine like somebody's recording a podcast and suddenly their, let's say, spherical podcasting recording mechanisms, like this flying sphere that's like they're recording the podcast through, suddenly it just gives this beep and it just goes on automatic mute and a flying motorcycle passes the person's balcony. Sometimes I wonder, is it possible to love the world really? And I have come to realize love is a sort of submission of the ego. It is as if like you're seeing a state that is free of the burdens of memory. The poet Rumi has this quote. He says something like, lovers don't meet somewhere, they're in each other all along. It's another way of saying that the truth of separate inner universes, it finds the common. The saints of modernity will be futurists guarding will be pretty much guardians of the future. I don't know how to say it, like I'm just trying to say that futurists are going to be like the modern saints in regards to wanting to guard it. At the edge of sight, truth cannot be denied. Thanks for listening. Much blessings and namaste.